Yes.
What this town needs is more people honking their horns trying to get through traffic. It's such an effective way to.
Never enough in Manhattan, right? I drove through
Oh,
Manhattan, like actually took my car there. I lived in DC for 7 years and actually drove through Manhattan twice, I think, for the experience. And I was like, I'm not scared
yeah.
of big city driving, but I'm also like, nope, this is not needed.
Yeah, same here. Same here. And I've been watching these ambulances making their way up. I think that's 7th Avenue there. And it's just terrible. Like and I'm watching the cabs. I'm like, the cabs just don't get out of the way. Like there's a I don't know. You can hear them. I don't know what hospital or whatever is up in here in Midtown Manhattan, but it's because yeah, we're right on Times Square. That's where we are.
Very nice. Well, it looks like we have about 170 people joining us so far. So just want to,
Yeah,
Tim and I are just catching up on weather and location, but welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. Appreciate it. We're just going to take a few more minutes and let people join in a little bit more. As we're getting started, though, if you want to drop in the chat section of the box and let us know what state you're either located in, or if there's a particular state you're interested in hearing about today, whether it's potential legislative changes or the election results, feel free to drop it in there. I'm also up in Fargo, North Dakota, so if anybody has more snow than me over the last 12 hours, please feel free to put that in the chat. I think we got 7 inches or something like that, so. We have a whole mix. Minnesota.
Yeah, it really is.
Oklahoma
I'm watching the states fill up. This is quite the national
Hawaii.
spectrum here.
Very nice.
Yeah.
About 200 of us going here. Massachusetts. Someone just rolled by real quick. My son goes to NDSU. Go buys and very nice, Christine. I'm a NDSU alum myself. Connor, who's also one of our hosts today, works on our Marcom team at Quorum, receives some brewery and treats from an uncle or I believe a girlfriend's uncle that lives in Fargo from the area. So he was just sending me all the treats he got from Fargo this morning for Christmas.
I've been lucky I think I've been to 47 state capitol buildings.
Nice.
But I've never been to Bismarck.
It's a nice little town. I lived there, worked in the state chamber for a while, a decade ago, so in a previous life, and it's a nice little town, and it's definitely grown since with all the oil activity. So
one of my favorite trivia questions, it's the only state capital that ends in 3 consonants. If you want to really stump somebody, that's a good one.
I did not know that. That's a good one to have. Thank you.
So now you know that. You got that going for you.
Perfect. Well, as everybody's logging in, we have about 225 of us now. Some housekeeping items before we kick off. This is being recorded and we will be sharing the recordings afterwards. So if you have to jump off early or if you want to share this with any colleagues post-fact, we will be sending that around. So thank you so much. Christine's also got her bucket list for North Dakota. It's great. So the recording will be taken care of. We'll also be taking Q&A during this session too. So feel free to drop them in the chat and or the question and answer section. I know Tim has a lot to get through today, so we may not get to every question, but we will do our best to make sure we get them peppered in there, but we will be sharing that. And we are at 4 minutes now, so I'm going to kick it off. And no introduction really needed, but I'd like to go through. Our presenter today is Tim Story, who is the CEO of the National Conference of State Legislators, or NCSL. He's just telling us he's actually up in New York City right now for legislative leadership retreat, getting ready for the January sessions kicking off. So Tim has been spent about the past 3 decades working for and studying state legislators, specializing in everything from redistricting to elections, organizational, and also legislative leadership. On top of that, he's also consulted internationally for multiple parliaments in more than a dozen countries. So Tim is definitely very well versed, and that's why we brought him in here today. So again, with no further ado, Tim, I'll turn it over to you, and everybody feel free to put your questions either in the chat or the Q&A portion. Thanks for joining.
Okay, well, I really appreciate Quorum, staging this webinar, and we have a lot to cover. So it is a dive in and let's go situation, because I'm going to really look at 3 things this morning. I'll look back at what happened in the elections. I think that's valuable. There's some distance now, so we have a little more clarity about that. I'll race through that fairly quickly. And then a run through of some of the ballot measures. This wasn't a huge ballot measure year, but it does give you some sense of what's going to happen in legislatures. And then we've done a big forecast exercise at NCSL, both kind of using multiple methodologies and looking at bill introductions and surveying legislative leaders and others, and we have a number of databases about bills and things coming up, and of course Quorum tracks that as well very, very efficiently. So we'll talk about some of the top level. This is such a difficult challenge because, as I think many of you know, legislatures will see well over 100 and I forget now 120,000 pieces of legislation introduced in any given year in the 50 states, of which about 20,000 will actually pass and get enacted. Far different from the federal government that does not see anything near that number of passages. So trying to say like, oh, this is the big thing that will happen across all 50 states is impossible, but there are some big themes that'll be driving many of the conversations on all of the issues. So we'll hit on those. So let's get to it. I do have slides, so you can follow along at home. I'm going to do the share slide now, and this will just be so quick and nimble. You won't even see it happening. That's
seamless for us.
Absolutely seamless. There we go. I assume everybody's seeing this beautiful title slide. So take a close look at it because we're moving on. Let's talk about elections. Let's go into the Wayback Machine all the way back to November the 8th of 2022. Today's didn't occur to me. Today's the 14th. So it's only been really 5 weeks. Seems like a much longer amount of time. This was, of course, the big midterm election. You had legislative elections in 88 chambers. You had 36 governor's races up this time. There were 20 Republican governors and 16 Democratic governors. So this was in some ways a year that the Republicans had more on the line, but relatively even. And you'll see that the governor's turnover was really low, and 2 of them were Republican governors in heavily blue states, Massachusetts and Maryland, that were term limited out and wound up going to the Democrats. So not a ton of the biggest takeaway from this election, not a lot of change. We are really in an era of partisan stability in legislatures and in governors. So they're just now going back to 3 election cycles with kind of modest turnover, which is unusual for really 20 years. Every 2 years brought, pretty substantial. The average number of legislative chambers that flips in a 2-year election cycle is 12. And here this year, you only have 4 that actually changed party hands. So it was a big year for elections, and there are now the other thing I want to point out is that there are now 7,386 state legislative seats. We at NCSL, of course, we're the association for all 50 legislatures, as well as the legislatures in the territories. So there were 7,383 state legislators in the 50 states, not counting the territories in Washington, D.C. But the state of the state of Wyoming has added 3 legislative seats, 2 in the House, 1 in the Senate. So now there will be 7,386 state legislators for NCSL to keep track of. And I think some of you have to keep track of all of them as well. So good luck with that. We know it's a constant challenge. Before the election, you had 31 Republican legislatures, 17 that were Democratic, and 2 that were divided. Virginia just went from Democratic control to a divided legislature where Republicans took the House in 2021. Before that, only Minnesota was the only state where you had the legislature divided between the 2 parties, with the Republican Senate and the Democratic House. I'm also, because I know we're among friends, we know at NCSL that Nebraska is technically nonpartisan, and we do indicate it like that on our website and other places, but I have colored it red for these slides, so we're going to call it Republican. Also, the only unicameral legislatures, I'm sure most of you know, only has a Senate. You will also see that Alaska has that big red color up in the top of your screen. But Alaska is a unique situation. They have a coalition arrangement in terms of legislative leadership control. So a relatively small number of small number of Republicans allied with the Democrats and have control there. That will be the same going into 2023 session. So yes, Alaska technically has more Republicans, but has a coalition leadership arrangement. So that's important to know for folks in Alaska and folks who work in Alaska. And there's always seems like there's one of those coalitions every 2 to 4 years. This will be a continuing situation for Alaska. So what changed in this election? As I said, not a lot. The Minnesota Senate somewhat unexpectedly went from Republican control to Democratic control. Everyone knew that Michigan was a toss-up. Both the House and the Senate go from Republicans to Democrats. And then Pennsylvania. And we have to sort of pause for just a second to talk about Pennsylvania, because the House in Pennsylvania is now technically, as of today, there are 100 Republicans in the Pennsylvania House and 99 Democrats. However, there are 3 special elections. It's in the courts as to exactly when those will be scheduled, but as of today, they're scheduled for February, first week of February. All 3 of those are in heavily Democratic districts. So, and I think I misspoke. There's 101 Democrats. Is that right? Yeah, 100 and maybe there's 102 and 100. There's 102 Republicans and 100 Democrats as of today. Yep. So if Democrats do as expected and pick up the 3 vacant seats, 1 due to a death and 2 to resignations, they will go to 102 Democrats and 101 Republicans. There are 203 seats in the Pennsylvania House. So when they go into session in January, there will be more Republicans, and there's really a lot of they're fighting between Speaker Brian Cutler and the incoming Democratic Speaker, assuming they pick up those 3 special elections. But I think in the end it's going to be Democratic. So let's call that another flip. So only 4 chambers flip in this election, all to the Democrats, and very unusual. In fact, it's the first time, I think, going all the way back to the 1930s, that in the midterm elections, the party in the White House gained legislative chambers. So this was in many ways a very good year for the Democrats in terms of legislative elections. What does that mean in terms of overall legislatures, or in terms of overall, there are now 29 Republican legislatures, 19 Democratic legislatures, and 2 that are divided. And that's if you're looking at it in terms of chambers, 59 Republican chambers, 40 Democratic chambers, and that's plus 4 Democratic chambers. So another way to look at that. Well, I just wanted to point out, I'm having a little bit of trouble here because I can't see the titles of my slides because the Zoom box is on the top. So I'm going to do a quick little thing and see if I can move this.
Yeah, you can move that guy to the.
I can move that little deal. That will help me tremendously. So I'm like, which slide is this? I'm pretty sure I know without seeing the titles.
It's also impressive, Tim.
This is something I really wanted to point out, that the's been a real downturn, and you only have 4 that change in this election cycle. So there just really does seem to be an era of stability in terms of legislative elections. All right. And another sort of thing is that we've got red states and blue states in terms of legislatures held by party. You've got only 2 that are divided now. That would be the Virginia and Pennsylvania. And then Alaska, you could also sort of consider as divided, since both Republicans and Democrats are in control through that coalition. Again, we have this data going all the way back to 1900, so we only look at it in terms of the numbers of members, because we don't know where there were coalitions back in the early part of the last century. So just looking at it straight on numbers, you've only got 2 divided legislatures, which is sort of remarkable. Again, this era of even party control. Another way to look at it is total number of seats. And Republicans continue to sort of be dominant in legislatures. If you look at it in terms of the big picture, 55% of all legislative seats held by Republicans, and 45% held by Democrats. Really small number of a third party or independent legislators, maybe 25, 30, if memory serves. Not counting the 49 senators in Nebraska who are technically nonpartisan, but again, majority Republican. And what you see when you look at this, it's kind of interesting. It goes back to 1900, and from the early 1950s all the way until 1994, which is where the Democrats really lose a ton of seats. That's when the Republicans take over Congress and Newt Gingrich becomes the speaker. And then you had this long period of about 20 years of parity between the 2 parties. And then Republicans have their best election in 2000 in 2010, which is a huge increase. In 2012, and I'm sorry, 2010, they make huge gains in legislatures, and then they control redistricting, which is then the gift that keeps on giving from 2010 all the way through until today, really 2022. And then, one of the big things to look at in this election in terms of legislatures was this showed you the seats that the president's party loses in midterms elections all the way back to 1902. There have been now 31 midterm elections, and the president's party has lost seats in legislatures in all of those midterms. So Democrats in this case, with only two exceptions. In 1934, when there's signs that the Great Depression is starting to lessen, and Democrats make huge gains under FDR. And then in 2002, George Bush is in the White House. It's his midterm, and it's the post 9/11 election, and Republicans make gains of about 175 seats. The average loss is around 400 seats total. So the fact that in this election, Democrats only lose around 50 seats, that in some ways was a big win for Democrats generally. And then, this is what a landslide election looks like. And there was some talk that Republicans, this was in 2010, as I referenced before, 24 chambers shifted, all of them to the Republican side, 2 to tied. And the reason I bring this up is that the change of just 4 chambers was really fairly minor. And it also sort of anchors us back to the election where Republicans had this huge gain, and that's put them in the driver's seat now for the past 12 years. Quickly talk about the governors. Going into the election, governors, 28 were Republican, 22 were Democratic, and again, very few changes. The only ones were in Massachusetts and Maryland, where the governors were Republican in these very blue states, and these 2 popular incumbents, Baker and Hogan, did not run, and those went to the Democrats. And then you had Nevada was the only incumbent governor that lost. So you had that switch from Sisolak, the Democrat, loses to the Republican Laxalt, and then there's a 4th one, and I'm blanking on it right now. But anyway, so only 4 governors switched, 3 of them to the Democrats, 1 to the Republicans. And then you look in terms of what does it mean overall, 23 Republican states, 17 Democratic states. This is the trifecta, all 3 chambers. 2 chambers plus the governor. So you have 17 Democratic states and 10 now that are divided. So the number of divided states actually goes down. The number of Democratic states goes up. Again, assuming that the Democrats wind up, even it doesn't matter if they wind up holding the House in Pennsylvania, which is fully expected because the governor will still be a Democrat with a Republican Senate.
Looks like the 4th flip you're looking for is Arizona.
Arizona, that's right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks to Katie. That was amazing.
It's because it's in my notes. They're on my slides, and we're doing this without my usual multi-monitor system here. So thank you for helping me out. A couple other things I want to point out about the election. Again, the number of women legislators actually went up a little more this election. Of course, they had a big gain in 2020 in terms of women in legislatures, but still, you're looking at only roughly 31.5% of all legislators are women. Far below the average in the U.S. population, which is 51% women. But I just think it's one of those demographic changes that was almost negligible from the 1800s all the way until the 1970s, and then in the 1970s and 1980s is just on this escalator, then kind of levels out for really 25 years, and then both in the last election and in this election you see some substantial gains again for women in legislatures, one of the big changes. So that's it for sort of legislative overview or election overview, and we'll talk about how that plays into the issues in just a second. But I think it's good to talk a little bit about the ballot measures that were on before voters across the country. This is just sort of shows you the states. The blue states are the ones that have the popular initiative where you can get signatures and put something on the ballot, and then the other states mostly are things where you have only the legislatures themselves can put things on the ballot through the referendum process. And this year there were only 133 ballot measures. The majority of those were legislative referrals. As you can see, that's the blue bar here. Still slightly down from the normal average, up in the 145, 150 ballot measures. And the number of citizen initiatives actually was off again. Some of that's the pandemic effect, the difficulty of getting signatures, which totally fell in 2020 during the pandemic. But there were some interesting things on the ballot, and I'm going to race through those. The big one, of course, that got most of the discussion was the abortion issue, which was a prominent election issue in just about every state. And interestingly, the states, there were 3 states that had access restrictions. Kansas, Kentucky, and Montana. The one in Kansas was earlier in the year, not in November. All of those failed. And then the 3 states that had abortion rights measures, access rights measures on the ballot, California, Michigan, Vermont, all passed. So sort of an interesting development there. And we kind of look at, are there bigger trans things in a number of states? And one thing that was sort of prominent were tobacco and drug issues. Of course, California, a major measure to ban sales of flavored tobacco products to minors, I believe. And then, of course, marijuana measures for the first time were kind of a mixed results, which is unusual because those measures have been fairly popular with voters, but voters in Arkansas, North Dakota, and South Dakota rejected. These were, I think, all retail or recreational marijuana measures. And then voters in Maryland and Missouri passed them, and both a combination of recreation and medical, I think, in Missouri. And then, Colorado became the second state to pass a measure legalizing psilocybin or sort of hallucinogens related to mushrooms and other natural drugs. I don't claim to know a lot about that, but Oregon was the first state to do that. Now Colorado has followed up to do that as well. Healthcare, always a major issue on ballot measures. But the biggest one, I think, is Oregon. You're going to hear a lot about Oregon moving to some kind of a single payer healthcare system. It's going to be not an easy task, but of course they were moving in that direction through the legislative process, and then the voters passed this constitutional right to health care. And then South Dakota became the latest state to expand Medicaid. I believe there are only now 11 states that have not expanded Medicaid, and I think you'll see some of those take a serious run at it, including North Carolina coming up in January. Gambling measures, these were all defeated in legislatures, but the most prominent were measures for sports gaming in California. Incredibly expensive ballot measures. I think well over $500 million spent both for and against these measures in California, but they failed. Illinois passed a constitutional right to collective bargaining. Tennessee voters approved the right to work amendment. And then there were a handful of minimum wage increases in DC, Nebraska, Nevada, which has been a very popular ballot measure in recent elections. Number of education measures on the ballot. In Arizona, they approved a measure to extend in-state tuition to immigrants, and then of course there were a number of funding measures for education, and that was really where the action was on the ballot measures. There were a whole lot of bond issues, relatively small tax measures, although they matter incredibly to the groups that they target, and so those passed, as well as in Colorado, California, Massachusetts, and New Mexico. Infrastructure, huge on the ballot, and I think that's a big theme for session starting in January. Alabama looked at broadband, public, and Nebraska air travel, money for air travel, airports, and other things. So just want to mention that infrastructure was huge. And then, of course, elections. I think that's been a big topic for the past 2 years. I don't think it's going to be a big topic moving forward. I'll touch on that in just a second. But voter ID laws passed in Nebraska, failed in Arizona, I believe. I got to double check that because it was still undecided when I did this a week or so ago. So I need to finalize that. Maybe somebody out there knows if that voter ID measure passed in Arizona. And then a number of things that really were sort of expanding election access in Connecticut and Michigan and Nevada, and then Ohio became another state to prohibit non-citizens from voting. Of course, non-citizens are not allowed to vote as it is, but they put it in their state constitution. Few other notable measures: Iowa, constitutional right to bear arms. Oregon went the other direction and put limits on gun ownership. Nevada passed an equal rights amendment, but that has to be voted on twice by Nevada voters, so that will be back on the ballot, I think, next time. A big affordable housing measure in Colorado that will need to be implemented, another major issue in many states coming up. Legislative term limits in North Dakota, that now makes them the 16th state to adopt legislative term limits, but first one in probably 15 or 20 years. So you haven't seen term limits on legislatures, new term limits in quite a while. And then if you're in Alabama, you now have a new constitution, which is a lot like the old constitution, which is the longest constitution in the world. So Alabama has the distinction of having the longest constitution, over 400,000 words, and it's because they put a lot of local, very specific local measures in the state constitution, but they actually cleaned up some archaic language and took some words out. But good for Alabama. They also still are number one longest constitution in the world.
You're giving us some good trivia.
That is something to know. So now before we go to 23 sessions, any quick questions about elections and ballot measures? I haven't been able to track.
Yeah, no worries. Looks like Katie said the voter ID did fail in Arizona.
It did. That's good to know.
Yep. And shout out to John for sharing a NCSL reference link for us in the chat. But could you give us the quick breakdown between citizen versus popular referendums when it comes to ballot measures?
Say that again, Jake. I just couldn't quite hear.
Oh, yeah. Could you give us a quick definition, the difference between citizen and popular referendum? That's a popular question in the chat.
Yeah, so a citizen initiative is sort of a new question that you get the language, usually have to get it approved by the Secretary of State or some authority in the state, and then you circulate that, get signatures, and if you pass a certain threshold, it varies. Every state has a different set of rules about how to qualify something for the ballot. The popular referendum is actually when you do the same thing, but you're trying to negate a law that was passed by the legislature. So you're essentially getting the voters to vote on something that the legislature enacted. Does that make sense? So it's not new language. It's actually just essentially a citizen's veto of a law. So that's popular referendum. And then legislative referendum is when the legislature refers something to the ballot.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And we had someone in chat share an NCSL reference link. So shout out for your resources at NCSL. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a good thing because I'm kind of flying here and I know I'm just missing a lot. And especially in this next section, we have a lot of detail about sort of our forecast for major issues in legislatures. And I will give the link at the end, and maybe somebody has it who's on here, but can put it in the chat. But if not, I've got it in the slides. So there's a whole lot of detail about these things. So let's talk about the big frames for what's coming up next year. Fiscal stability, plus. This is probably the best fiscal shape that states have been in perhaps ever. And there's a whole variety of reasons for this. Of course, most people are aware of the close to $6 trillion in federal stimulus money in various packages, both COVID relief, infrastructure, Inflation Reduction Act, that have been put into the U.S. economy, and all of those pieces of federal legislation had substantial amounts of those funds going to the states, to legislatures. So that money's been coming into states at the same time, but most all of it designated for very specific, economic relief programs, infrastructure programs, that kind of thing. But it does have a huge impact on state fiscal conditions. And this is all in terms of revenue and rainy day funds. States across the board have essentially filled their rainy day funds to their statutory capacities, the caps that are required, and many states have an amount of money that is sort of the max they'll put into their rainy day funds. Some have exceeded that amount of money, have made special provisions to put more money in rainy day funds, and revenues are up. So almost every sort of revenue stream has seen increases in almost every state. And what's really unique, I think, about looking at the fiscal situation in states right now is that it's like all 50 states. Usually when you tell this story, whether it's bad or good, there are outliers. The energy states are doing great when other states are not doing great. Or the energy states or the tourism states are doing poorly when the other states are doing poorly. So it's specific to some of the specifics of state economies. Now, having said this, oil has been steadily declining, and we do have a handful of states which rely heavily on energy prices, and Alaska being number one. Almost entirely 90% of their budget, I think, comes from excise taxes on oil and gas. So when oil goes down, and now I think it's sitting at about $72, $73 a barrel. So that may be a warning sign for some of the energy states. They're now seeing declines in energy prices. But this is a very volatile scenario with the U.S. economy. And having listened to numerous economists of late, it's hard to say where things go. But that's the big underlying theme for all of 23 sessions. You have states and legislators who know, and I've talked to many of them, that they have funding. What they don't know is what happens around the corner. And that's always the case, of course. You can't see around the corner, both metaphorically or literally. I think there's a huge emphasis on what can we do in terms of one-time spending. So if I'm in whatever you advocate for out there, if there are programs you have, there's still a good time to have a healthy discussion about those if you have them teed up and you've laid the groundwork for that. But the more you can frame it as not long-term spending for the state, the better your case is going to be, because every legislator I talk to, especially the appropriations chairs, they are keenly aware that they don't want to put continued spending into the budget because they're all concerned about a possible recession. I've spoken with sort of let's call it a focus group of probably 15 or maybe even 20 top legislative leaders, speakers of the House, Senate presidents, and then many other legislators for that matter. And in the 30 years I've been hanging around legislatures, I've never seen such unanimity on what is the big issue. All they're talking about is this workforce issue. And it rolls through everything. It rolls through public safety. It rolls through education. It rolls through healthcare. So legislators across the 50 states are trying to figure out how to cope with this workforce shortage. And that's both for state agencies, the workforce that they have to be directly accountable for, as well as the private sector employment, because they're all coming to their legislatures and saying, you got to do something. And so they're looking at all kinds of stuff. And then there were the things that were in elections, the people talked about when they were campaigning. Republicans tended to talk about crime. Democratic candidates, many of them were talking about abortion access issues. Republicans are talking about school choice and tax cuts. Those are going to be prominent, especially in the states that are now, again, either Republican or Democrat. I think mental health is another big issue, especially in the healthcare area. That's sort of the number one prominent issue. It's really fascinating to me. Again, my little unscientific focus group of leaders, but it is very bipartisan, this notion that this is a major issue that needs to be addressed, as well as housing affordability. So those are sort of the top, big headlines. Let's dig into them a little bit more. First off, the fiscal issues, and I do want to kind of look at some notes here. As I kind of went into some detail about this already, legislative budgets are incredibly stable. Rainy day funds full. Revenues continuing to show positive signs. Just a few warning lights on the dashboard, but for the most part, you talk to fiscal appropriations chairs, you talk to fiscal staff, directors around the country, and they're saying, hey, we're really lined up at surplus. They're getting reports of we've got this surplus or that surplus. So what does that mean? I think legislators are going to be looking at all of the above. Tax cuts are very popular, both in terms of rebates, direct rebates, more money into taxpayer pockets, as well as directed tax cuts, many of them, particularly in Democratic states, for lower income residents, and then some are flat out permanent, reduce the rate. Mississippi's looking at even eliminating their state income tax. So it's sort of an across the board approach in terms of cutting revenue, but also there's still a lot of money for spending and increased programs as long as they are temporary. And I think that the place where they're going to be looking to spend money is in labor, employment, and workforce issues. Unemployment remains historically low. It's under 3% in 20 states. And states are looking at all kinds of ways to do creative approaches in terms of putting in apprenticeship seems to be the buzzword now. It has been for a little while. But you see a whole lot of other things. Poaching workers from other states. I don't think that seems to be more popular than ever, where states are directly advertising and saying, "Hey, look at our state. We've got a much better environment for you to come work in," and running ads in other states and saying, your state's terrible and my state's better, and I find that kind of remarkable. Looking at remote work and how that's changed the workforce and how to adjust tax systems around remote work, that's a big issue in states. And just trying to find groups of workers that are maybe traditionally out of the workforce and underrepresented. Formerly incarcerated people. I've seen a number of bills and programs to look at, sort of changing the rules about how people who have done time are back into the workforce. People with disabilities, parents without childcare, huge issue in terms of the workforce. And you're going to see legislatures looking really hard at that childcare issue. And again, this skills gap for private sector employers. Lots of apprenticeship programs and establishing specific programs to train healthcare workers like nurses, teachers, and people in education, and really ratcheting up. Michigan in their lame duck session has just passed a huge bill on teacher pay and teacher recruitment. And I think that's going to be sort of the first of many programs like that. And by the way, that's the Republican legislature with the Democratic governor doing that before the new Democratic legislature comes in. There's still just a few other issues that fall under this workforce. The pandemic revealed that unemployment insurance programs for states were horribly outdated. A number of states have modernized them, but there's still quite a few that have to do that. And some states are going to be looking at retirement savings programs and plans that they can run for private sector employees. I think a number of states had bills in on that, and I think it's going to be something that'll get more discussion this time around. Looking at portable benefits, again, something that's gets a lot of discussion, has not been tried extensively, and more paid family and medical leave I think something that legislatures will be looking at. All right, the next big issue, health. I have to say, I think the workforce issue is the biggest thing in healthcare across the board. Again, every role within the healthcare system, it's just going to be a broken record in terms of the workforce. But the biggest issue is mental health. It's like someone described it as a second hurricane hitting the United States. If you can imagine, the pandemic was the first hurricane and just devastated the whole country in many ways. And this mental health after effect is kind of closely related to that. The fentanyl crisis you got to put into this bucket, I guess. The New York Times, or no, sorry, the Washington Post series on the fentanyl crisis has been really remarkable this week. If you haven't seen that, and the numbers, the opioid. If we were in the 5 years ago, every state's looking at the opioid crisis, and they passed all kinds of legislation to address it. And it's almost like it has just come back with a vengeance, specifically around fentanyl and, ease of production and that kind of thing. More discussion of telehealth. I think that happened a lot last sessions, but it will be back on the board for legislatures. And again, mental health in schools, mental health for teens. That's a specific area that's huge in the health area. And I kind of doubled up on that, so I'm just going to jump over that. Although again, and I got to glance at my notes here. I think the big issues in education, workforce issues, and that's I hear from legislatures and legislative staff across the country. It's bus drivers, it's janitorial staff, it's cafeteria staff, it's teacher aides, it's teachers, it's administrators. There is a huge crisis in terms of workforce for education. And there's many issues contributing to that. Of course, the pressure on cost of living and salaries is a big one, and states are going to be putting. I can guarantee you're going to see substantial raises in across the board for education workers, because that's, as you know, the biggest thing that states fund. And then the decline in achievement that happened because of COVID. There's, no one has a magic solution to that, but I think legislatures are going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to do, and using the ESSER funds that came from the federal government, which was a massive investment. There's still a lot of that money that's yet to be designated. But again, stop me if you've heard this before. It's workforce when it comes to education. Public safety, I think there was a lot of discussion of crime, and I think there's a strong perception among Americans that the crime is on the increase. And we know some of the data is very clear, specifically property crimes around vehicles. I know car thefts are have spiked dramatically in many parts of the country. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the supply shortage, of vehicles and economic opportunity for people who are willing to do bad things to do that. And it was a major issue for Republican candidates. So I think you're going to see a huge emphasis on just sort of street crime. But the biggest problem is workforce, the number of people qualified and available to be in policing, as well as in the incarceration side of it. Prisons and prison workers are short. So you'll see another look at penalties for nonviolent crimes. Because of if you don't have enough people to man prisons and man the system, you got to look at ways to manage the number of people in the system. And that, I think the staff shortage is going to be a huge issue here, in addition to sort of street crime. A few more issues, and then maybe there's a few questions. Want to talk about energy. This is closely tied to the two big federal laws, the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think you're going to see a lot of states continue to look at energy grid modernization. It's a top issue, especially given the relationship with the federal legislation that was passed. Texas, of course, continues to look at their energy grid after the problem they had a year or so ago. And then just sort of consumer home efficiencies and energy saving efficiencies, the EV infrastructure for vehicles. Continued looking, I think, probably more emphasis on nuclear and hydrogen as energy options, than both of which have been on the increase. There's a lot of incentives from the federal government on hydrogen, so legislatures are looking at that. But it's just the constant balancing act with energy of affordability, environmental impacts, resiliency of the sources. And how reliable they are, especially in light of the climate issues that are coming along. Transportation, I think this is just big. That it's the spending the infrastructure funds wisely. A lot of oversight by legislatures and a lot of discussion. They're all kind of tracking that they're getting the huge infusion of infrastructure funding, and that a lot of that's going to be in transportation. But the day of reckoning with the gas tax has arrived. The gas tax as structured is just not enough to fund transportation in many states. And as the U.S. passenger fleet becomes continuously more fuel efficient, gas tax revenues are not able to keep up. So they're going to be a more look again at options to the traditional gas tax. And of course, a lot of that's related to electric cars, which are clearly the automakers are pushing that, as well as the consumers. And then just traffic safety is always a constant concern for legislators. So, our staff say, hey, you can't ignore traffic safety. I'm already talked about infrastructure, so I'm going to just kind of wrap this up. Here's an issue I think is going to actually be on the decline. The last 2 years, there was intense pressure on sort of election process, election administration. The post-mortem seems to be fairly clear that this election was well run and went fairly smoothly. So you'll see some lingering efforts at mainly funding elections. A lot of the laws that passed put additional pressures on election administration people. So they got to put the money in to make sure they can accomplish what they're asked to do. And of course, many states passed legislation they can never accept private funding for elections because of what happened in 2020. So they'll have to step up and put their own money into that. Continued issues around voter ID, but I think that's now kind of out on the fringes. Environment's all about resiliency. California is clearly leading the way on this, but I think many other states, including Florida, a traditionally clearly a Republican-led state, but are taking the lead on climate resiliency. Natural disasters cost over almost $300 billion to U.S. economy last year, a record. That was in 2021. And that's hitting insurance programs. So you're going to be looking at insurance as it relates to environmental disasters. And then I think it's really important to realize for people who may not be there that the drought in the West is sort of unfathomable for folks who haven't quite realized and seen the effects of the drought in many in the Western states. And so it's a lot of pressure. And then PFAS, the federal funding to deal with that mitigation of the PFAS chemicals. I'm going to wrap up. It's interesting what difference a few weeks makes. Or a few years, 2 years ago or a year ago, it felt like every legislator wanted to get their hand around crypto and digital assets and distributed autonomous organizations, DAOs and NFTs. That does not seem to be the buzz as much anymore in legislatures, as you can imagine. And now it's kind of shifted to this consumer protection aspect, especially in light of what happened with the FTX in the last few days. So I think this is an issue that if you had the 10, this is probably going down on the list in terms of things legislatures. I think there's probably more of a wait and see approach to digital assets and crypto. But I really, this is where, and I know people early on talked about, let me go to the final, or no, that is my last one for state federal. I really want to include sort of cybersecurity, privacy, internet privacy in that bucket of, I shouldn't say crypto, I should say something different, but there's no doubt that privacy remains a huge concern for legislatures. And I think it's going to be a top tier, top 5 issue in at least half of the states. So I think it's a major issue, and as well as
the crypto roller coaster will never end.
Broadband, it's something that they just hear constituent reports out of it, and again, it's changing by the day because of the big platforms and what's happening at Twitter and other places. So I guarantee legislature is going to be getting into that. I'll wrap up. Let me just do the state federal is all I want to say about this, because I don't have time to go into the state federal issues. I don't think you're going to see much policy making from the federal government in the next 2 years. I think the states and the legislatures, who, of course, I always think are the most innovative and creative, are going to be taking the lead. They are the laboratories of democracy, as Justice Brandeis said back in the 30s. And I think that's going to be especially true in the next 2 years. And you look at these major issues, it's just hard to have much optimism about Washington working together, given the dynamics with the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. So I don't see much coming out of Washington. So I think if you're talking to the people who are decision makers, and you have stake in federal in public policy, you want to be working these state legislatures, especially some of the lead cows, the bell cows that are going to be out there doing stuff. All right, that was a lot, and
that was great. Thank you, Tim.
That was way more than I wanted to talk.
Well, we have some questions coming in. Do you think, kind of around the the conversation of funding, with a lot of federal dollars being injected into state and local budgets during COVID, do you think, I don't want to say unfunded mandates because it's not quite what they are, but do you see or do you hear any worries about kind of a vacuum gap or replacement funding for dollars that were coming in the last 2 years specific to COVID support?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we're just starting to hear some of those stories. I just heard recently, I won't say which state, but this legislator was talking about his local governments that had hired a whole bunch of new people using their stimulus money, and now wanted the state to come in and sort of carry them moving forward. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. So I think there is a little reckoning coming for particularly for local governments that use some of those stimulus funds in ways that put permanent budget pressures on that may not be sustainable. And it's interesting. We've got I think the uncertainty of the economy is, people say this stuff all the time. It's the worst I've ever seen. It's the greatest in a generation. Blah 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 blah. It's a crisis. All these words get overused. But uncertainty is the word of the day for me when it comes to sort of the economic outlook for the country writ large, because you've got such a weird set of dynamics that are somewhat unprecedented in terms of our economic history, certainly in modern economics. So the reason I say that is that legislators are aware of this. We've got all this money, but they're extremely nervous because of the notion that they don't know what happens with inflation, what happens with the recession.
Yep.
I assume while we've been on here, two things have happened. We've got a 50 basis point increase in the prime rate, and then the soccer game between France and Morocco is about to start. So the point is that I'm not sure that the rates are going to tame inflation, right? So legislators are really conflicted. Lots of money, but really cautious about spending that money.
Absolutely. And I know we have a lot of questions on a lot of broad topics, right? Transportation to affordable housing to LGBTQ plus rights. Opposed to addressing any specific one of those right now, I'm curious, you don't have a magic 8-ball, which is the joy of the hope,
actually.
Right?
Science point to yes.
Are we, largely speaking, do you think we're in a political climate where the blues are getting bluer and the reds are getting redder from control perspective? So any one of those topics, if you're in a red state or blue state, do you think the traditional philosophy of those parties will double down on either the good or the bad associated with that? Or do you think we're more in a potentially bipartisan era, which sounds so weird, but what's your thought on the state level that could almost cover a lot of topics, I guess?
Well, this jumps me to my last slide, which I forgot I had thrown in here, which is sort of some key takeaways. I'm not going to read these. I'll let you guys look at it, but I want to look at the third bullet point on the other side, which is the 4M states. So these are states that are now under Democratic control that have not been. Right now, you granted in Maryland and Massachusetts, you had Republican governors who worked well with their legislatures. And now you've got Democratic control in Michigan and Minnesota. Minnesota was Democratic not so long ago, but I do think both of these things are true. I think that the blue and the red states are going to act like blue and red states. They are, if you're in Texas, you're going to see conservative Republican approaches to policy, but you've also got a dynamic where there are divides within both parties. And that is particularly highlighted. Texas is a great example. You clearly got a more moderate House led by Speaker Phelan and a conservative Senate led by Dan Patrick. And so I think that is true. Blue states are going to act like blue states and red states are going to act like red states. I will say this. As I'm looking across the country right now at some of the leadership elections, so this is really at sort of a level or two below the radar. What I see is the more, I don't want to say centrist Republican leadership and Democratic leadership, but these are the people who are a little bit more towards the middle. That I think the extremes of both parties, not true entirely everywhere, but across the board. There does seem to be a yearning to work together more. That theme has been constant, and I'm hearing it from really conservative leaders as well as liberal leaders. I was with a group of Republican leaders recently, and these were really conservative guys, mostly men in this case. And all they could talk about was the difficulty within their caucuses. That's what most leaders talk about when you get them in a room. But I think there's just a real desire to move away from the just scorched earth approach to policy making. So I'm optimistic that we might see a turn on that and starting in 2023.
Interesting. So we have a question too related to we brought up around transportation infrastructure and the gas tax. As I said, the gas tax is really not supporting infrastructure as much, and will be less and less as cars using fuel become more efficient, and then obviously electronic vehicles. Where are you seeing the shift for that funding coming from, and or does that put other policies at jeopardy or at second string compared to the need to fund those infrastructure at the state level?
Well, one, you got the huge infusion of the federal money right now, so there's sort of like it's maybe the urgency isn't quite what it might be otherwise relative to the the infrastructure act. But the big question that seems like every legislator wants to explore, not every legislature, is this a road use fee of some kind, and how to structure that, how to establish it. I'm sure there are other ideas out there, but that is the one that always jumps out when you get a group of transportation chairs in a room and experts. And of course, there's many implementation challenges to that. Of course, you have the fees on electric cars, which are going up.
Yep.
Proud electric car owner. I'm a Chevy Bolt guy and have been for 6 years now. I know Colorado, I think, is looking at raising their electric car fee. Because I don't pay any gas tax. Never.
Yeah.
But I do use the roads. So I think it's a combination of those two things, and then there whatever other creative solution legislatures can come up with, right? And the people who feed them ideas, which is probably where the ideas will come from.
Nice. I have two more quick ones for you before we wrap up. We've had a few questions on affordable housing. What trends I know you brought it up in your slide earlier, but where do you see that going, or do you think that it was listed, Brian, your high on your list there, but where do you see that going, or where do you see changes potentially happening?
What's interesting is that it is high on the list. I think it's just not an issue that has traditionally been on top 10 lists for a number of years. But and of course, the homeless issue that plays into this, and then of course all the economic pressures on building, and then the disruption in supply chains with the pandemic. There's a lot of factors that are driving this conversation that have seemed to have made it worse and worse and worse. So I don't know I can't really say the answer so much. I mean, I think that one, I'm not an expert in it, so I want to be really careful not to get too far out on the limb. But what I do think is sort of a bring all answers to the table, because there's not one thing that's going to solve it. Because there's is it a mental health issue with homeless people? Yes. Is it rents are incredibly high and there's not enough supply? Yes. Is it just an urban problem? No. I think you've also got housing issues in rural areas as well. So, but primarily an urban problem. So I could go on, but I think the most important thing that I can share is that it's a top issue. And I'm hearing it from both leaders of both parties. It's not just a one-party issue. So they've got to figure out a way, and whether it's putting more money or more financial incentives into expanding housing. And then at the same time, you've got this odd disruption of the workforce with remote work still playing itself out. I mean, you still got major cities in the United States that have remarkably low worker rates coming into cities. I mean, I'm here in New York City. Denver's the same way. Washington, if you're in Washington, there's just so many people who aren't going into cities. So you've kind of got this decline of workforce coming in on a daily basis, and then looking at other places to live. So very complicated issue, but it's top one.
Yes. Well, I know we got a minute left, so I just want to wrap up. Tim, first of all, thank you. Thank you for everybody joining today. We will be sharing this content afterwards. As a reminder, NCSL has a lot of fantastic resources, from legislative dates and contact and resource information. So please feel free to check out their website. As always, if you have any questions about functionality around software, Quorum is more than happy to help you out as well. But again, Tim, thank you for your time today. We appreciate it so much. Your insight was fantastic.
Oh, I appreciate that, Jay. You guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks all.
I should have stopped sharing there, Jake.